Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Drew Armstrong. I'm Bloomberg News' senior editor for healthcare, and I'd like to welcome our audience to the Technology Summit and also to our first panel. We're going to be talking about the role of AI in healthcare and in particularly its usage in drug development. I'm joined today by Dave Johnson, the Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Officer at Moderna Therapeutics, and also Najat Khan, the Chief Data Science Officer and the Global Head of Strategy and Operations for Janssen Research and Development, which is the drug arm of the absolutely massive healthcare company, Johnson & Johnson, though getting a little bit smaller with some of the planned business changes over there. We are going to be talking about AI in drug development, and I want to really start with a definition and kind of table setting question for our panel, just to get them to define what AI means to them in the world of healthcare and drug development. It's a word that gets it's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot. It's a very buzzy one. Everybody says that they are doing this. So just to begin, Dave, do you want to start us off, and then we'll move over to Najat? How do you define AI in drug and in healthcare? And then maybe if you can give us a couple of examples, that help us concretize that.
Sure thing. It's a question we hear a lot and something we think about a lot as we talk about how we communicate with our business stakeholders. We think of AI, artificial intelligence, as, a computational system that reaches a level of achievement, think of problem solving or identifying information from data that we normally associate with human intelligence. So it is by its nature somewhat subjective, but we like to couch in kind of really concrete value for the business. In the healthcare more broadly, you're seeing a lot of really impressive stuff. DeepMind's recent AlphaFold is an example of solving the protein folding problem, as well as the advances in digital pathology, where algorithms are able to extract so much more information out of imagery than humans are able to. At Moderna, we've had success in a number of different areas. One I'll cite is, what we've done in terms of data analysis, right? There's a huge amount through a research and development pipeline of data from assays, and humans can do this manually, but, robots can do it, algorithms can do it much faster, much more efficiently, and with much better quality. And in a lot of cases, we find the algorithms are able to find information in detail within that data that humans wouldn't be able to.
Najat, question over to you. I mean, the same thing. How do we define AI in healthcare and drug discovery? And really, where do you draw the line between, a computing task, or a technological task and AI? Where is that separation?
Yeah, and a great question. In terms of the definition, I think it was defined really well. What I'll do is dive a little bit deeper into what are the applications, because that's where it becomes real. To your point, there's so much hype. And to make it real in healthcare, I think you have to start with what are those outcomes that will improve our pipeline, enhance our pipeline, right? So either improve the probability of success of a program that's actually going to be successful, or do things faster and quicker. And I will give you a couple of examples where we're seeing a lot of progress already. So, there was a little bit around how computer vision and AI can actually see and extract more information out of, say, digital pathology images. So one of the things we are doing is, as we go more towards rare diseases, or diseases where there's a specific mutation you want to target, the challenge is to then find the patient, right? Because you're making it inherently a more rare disease as you go more towards medicine. So there we've had success with looking at histopathology images that are digitized and then be able to predict the mutational status of a patient. Why is that important? With these new mutational biomarkers, a lot of people are not sequenced, but they're actually, everybody gets a pathology image for their biopsy. So, what you can do there is actually find the right patients that will actually respond to the right. And to do that, you asked about the delineation between computer programming, et cetera, and AI. I don't see it as all of the approaches are sort of equal in terms of the problem you're trying to solve. I'll give you another example also where we're seeing a lot of progress from AI. So, when we talk about clinical trials that are run today, these trials take a long time. And also, it's hard to recruit patients and the right patients and have the right diversity. What we're starting to do is use AI and machine learning in order to predict the performance of these sites and where the patients are de-identified. And then you can, in a more targeted way, go to where the patients that are eligible for the trial exist versus doing it the old way, which is where do we have relationship with some academic medical stuff. Why is that important? I mean, you've heard the stat, only 4% of eligible patients enroll in a trial. And diversity is generally a challenge. So we used AI machine learning models for a COVID-19 vaccine. And we actually were able to accelerate by predicting where the hotspots are going to be across the world by about 6 weeks from the development timeline. So this is a real hard example of where you have impact by using AI machine learning.
I want to ask you all a little about the data landscape as it exists. There's obviously a huge amount of information in the healthcare space, and you think about medical records and the huge amounts of genetic information that are out there. I mean, it is a immensely rich data environment. But one of the challenges that I feel like I've heard about from a lot of people, Dave and I, we had a little bit of a discussion about this when we were doing our prep call, and I've heard about it from other folks working in the space, is that actually turning that into usable information for computing program, for computing processes, for using it in AI, that is where a lot of the challenge is. Can you guys talk to me about the gap between information as it exists in healthcare, of which there's a ton, and then actual usable data in the types of processes you're talking about, and kind of where we are on that journey?
Yeah, I mean, happy to jump into that. I think that's such a critical question. To do data science or AI well, you need good longitudinal linked data set. So there lies in the problem. There's a lot of data that's being generated, but it's not connected. If it's not connected, it's fragmented. Then how do you use AI to be able to predict who's going to progress to a certain disease, who's going to respond better to a certain treatment, right? The longitudinal aspect of it, that's one of our biggest challenges from a data perspective. And then the other is data missingness. Now, I can go to a physician and then I'll go to a different physician, a different health system. If those are not connected, then there are gaps in my healthcare, journey. And if you use that for AI machine learning, then you will over-index in some areas and under-index in other areas where there's missing data. And if you especially think about a lot of the real-world studies that are done, regulatory approvals that we need, one of the biggest questions we get asked is data missingness. And are you able to show that you have mitigated that? So those are the problems. But I will say one thing, that we are starting to see progress in that space. So some of you might have heard about a concept called tokenization, which actually enables you to de-identify, to anonymize data, but then actually link up various fragmented sets of data for specific patients, for patients' journey. So you're basically stitching together those data. I think that has happened quite a bit in the US with claims data and then more with EHR data. And that's allowing us to do more with AI than we could have done before. But I want to mention a watch out, because a lot of the times the data sets can sometimes be biased. They don't have the right representation, right? You don't want just data sets from certain states and not the others. You want racial, distribution to be appropriate to what we see in the US. So there's a lot of that kind of problem, Drew, that we're still working through. But that's where kind of the field is headed in terms of being able to connect data. The last thing I'll say, I wish we had the data sets in the Nordics, right? Where you have cradle to grave, connected omics to claims to hospital records. We are not there for most countries in the world, but I think there's a movement towards that.
What I would add, I think that was a great overview of the landscape and the challenges, particularly in the real world side. But what I'd add is, biology is really complicated. And it sounds simple to say, but just like, I don't think you can overstate how complicated it is. And the more challenging and complicated a problem is, the more data you need to have, and the higher the data quality you need to have. And so we have this kind of double problem where we really do need way more data and way more structured, valued, curated data sets. But also the complexity of biology also means that the data capture systems end up kind of erring into the side of like the lowest common denominator. So think, patients' notes, like physicians' notes, like handwritten notes, text, like there's a lot of information there, but there's not a lot of extractable data value that we can use. And it happens all across the R&D pipeline as well, from, academic journals and, lab notebooks where scientists are writing text content. It's really hard for algorithms to make use of that. And so, what we're doing, and what I think a lot of the industry is going to start doing as well, is investing a huge amount of effort in how we structure that data to begin with, like how we capture it in ways to get that full longitudinal picture, as was said here, so that you can actually feed those into algorithms.
Can I ask you all, we've seen this real explosion of, wide population genetic data over the last decade or so. Whether it be companies like 23andMe, BGI and what they're doing in China, a whole range of genetics startups that are really focused on. I mean, you have these, the consumer pitch of, hey, give us your genes and we'll let you do, this, that, fun kind of thing with it. But it is a huge creation of genetic information across wide spectrums of populations and, decode and things like that. Where does that fit into the work that that the field is doing and what that makes possible? And I do want to try and relate that back to the, to the data challenge question of the usability of that data. Is that usable data, or how wide is the span of quality and usability for those big, huge genetics data sets that we've seen become available in recent years?
And I think there is definitely usability in the target identification. So that's the most upstream step of creating a medicine. You're trying to ascertain what is that pathophysiology, as we call it. Like, is there a protein that's misfolded? What's causing the disease, right? And I think the explosion in genetics and also other omics data sets is helping us do that, because you can mine that to see, what are the signatures? Is it actually one disease? Is Crohn's really one disease? Is diabetic macular edema one disease? Or is it actually 6 sub-diseases within that disease, right? So it's redefining how to think about it. The challenge, though, Drew, is that while you have an explosion of genetic data, it's not always connected to the patient's clinical outcomes. If you don't have that connectivity, then you can't answer a lot of the questions that we need to answer, such as, if this person has a certain genetic mutation, are they faring better or worse? Is there more unmet need? So again, it comes back to that longitudinality, but it's great to see that the more genetic data is exploding. Here's what I would say. The space where we're going into is more prospective, multimodal data collection. So take UK Biobank as an example, 500,000 lives, where you're getting longitudinal data, everything from omics in a consistent basis to all of those clinical outcomes I was mentioning. And you also have other data sets that are large now, 5 million, 6 million being created, but they're prospective. So they're taking a little bit of time to get built out, but you need the multimodal aspect of it for a patient, not just the omics, not just the clinical outcomes, you need both. And then what I'll say is, practically here and now, what we're doing, my team and others in the industry, let's look at the question at hand that we're trying to answer. Let's look if the data exists to be able to answer it. The question has to be important for the medicine, and do the diligence on, is the data and the methodology good enough? And for some of these questions is actually appropriate. While for others, we have to invest in these prospective multimodal.
The other area where this kind of omics explosion is really helpful is in the way we run our clinical trials themselves, particularly in the rare disease and oncology spaces, where things are becoming increasingly personalized, where it really does come down to, what is that specific person's DNA that's going to help find the most effective treatment. And so we just now have an explosion of different omics data that we can, pull together and try to understand the clinical outcomes in a way that's not just like, did it work or not, but, which patients did it work in and why.
I want to turn to you, Dave, with the next question. I mean, I feel like for years I've been hearing people talk about the idea that we can treat biology in the same way that we do computing. I mean, you can reprogram things and do this or that. And I want to get your assessment of, is that the right way to think about things? Will it be the right way to think about things in the future, even if it's not now? Or is that a little bit overhyped? I mean, where do you fall on that?
I think that's largely true from my perspective, and I'm biased. I'm a software engineer and data scientist by training. So when I learn more about biology, dig into it, I can just see the same kind of patterns of the programmable nature of biology, and it's evidenced with what's been done with messenger RNA and Moderna, right? We built this platform concept of the company of, we have this mRNA technology and we can code into it whatever we want, whatever protein sequence we need. And it was that platform, this programmable technology, that I think gave us, really unprecedented speed at the beginning of the pandemic. We went from sequence identification, so when the sequence was listed by the Chinese authorities, to designing, manufacturing, and shipping clinical grade material for our phase 1 in just 42 days, which is crazy. This is normally something that takes years, but we were able to do that because of this platform we had built, because of the technology and algorithms that are built on top of nature. And there's a wide variety of other kind of technologies other than messenger RNA that are being piloted outside of messenger RNA in this genomic era. But I would say you can only push that metaphor so far. I mean, it's kind of like having a programming language, but it's a language we didn't write for a system we didn't invent and didn't build, And so while we've learned so much about, the biology programming and have used it successfully to create medicines, and I think that will continue to grow, there's still a tremendous amount of information and research we need to do.
Yeah.
Najat, do you want to jump in there? Yeah.
Yeah, I might have a slightly different perspective. My background as a data scientist and actually a scientist as well. As a scientist, you just have to acknowledge how little we know about the biology. We have 20 to 25,000 genes, and we don't really know the functions of most of them or how to modulate it. There is just, I'm always humbled by how little we know and how much we've done from the little bit that we know. Now, having said that, I think we're in a great spot right now. The amount of innovation that's happening, Dave mentioned, in Moderna, but also in other parts of our industry is fantastic. But it's hard to program something when you know so little about something to begin with. So I think that is a humbling thing for me. However, I think data science plays an exceptionally important role to be able to compute large amounts of data and then actually look at it in a very unbiased way. I think often we tend to be, as scientists, we see we're very data driven, but quite frankly, we can be a lot more data driven and do it in an unbiased way and add to our experiential knowledge. So I think we might be there in the next couple of decades, but right here, right now, it's not programmable. However, we're on the path to do that.
I wanted to ask you, when we think about where the field is now in comparisons, just to extend the metaphor a little bit. If we compare this to kind of the development of technology and computing over the last half a century, are we in the 1970s? Are we in the 1980s? Is it the 90s yet? Where are we? And I also want to use this as a moment to ask you all, when we think about what, for outsiders, what progress is going to look like here and where we're going to see kind of breakthrough innovation happen, how should people think about observing that? Is there going to be a moment where it's like, oh my gosh, and we've had a eureka moment, all of a sudden we can do things we can do differently than we did before? Or is this going to be a very slow incremental process? Talk to me through kind of the hurdles and where you all see the potential for solving some of those things and how that's going to look to outsiders.
Well, I'd say if you think about, I love the analogy of thinking about, what decade we're in, but even technology, look at the course that it's evolved, in the 60s at the early computers, no one imagined, like we'd be here on a video conference call talking through, the internet, like no one imagined that. And it's not something that just happened overnight in big waves. So it's an evolution. And I think you'll see the same thing in the healthcare space too. And I couldn't agree more with the comment about like how utterly complicated all of this is and how little we know about it. But you can see these recent advancements, or you can see these new technologies as kind of really promising visions of the future, and I see tremendous more of these coming.
Yeah, I agree with that. So in terms of the decade, I think we are definitely well into the 90s. We are at that like inflection point, not the small blips, but at the steep inflection point. And the thing that gets me excited is we're seeing impact now. If you talk to people 2-3 years ago, and Dave, I think will agree, there was a lot of aspiration of what data science could do or AI could do. Now it's happening. So it's going to be an evolution. A few examples where I think it's going to change a lot. One, in the whole space of early detection, right? We have algorithms where we have developed using commonly used procedures like ECG, where you can actually detect certain rare diseases several years in advance. Why is that important? You can't diagnose the patient. Even if you have the best medicines, you can't really make it better. And this is something that can happen passively, right? So you don't need new devices for it. And I think that, Drew, to your question about the obstacle, if you start to add new practices, we know how hard it is to add or build a new category. It is challenging, right? The other area I think you're going to see it make a huge difference is around digital endpoints. We talk about Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, talk about immunology. The way you figure out if somebody's getting better or worse is so subjective. Sometimes it's like a questionnaire. And we all know how much variability we have day in and day out. So using a lot of sensors, wearables to actually develop better endpoints to understand who's getting better versus not, huge push. If we have a phone that can do all of this, why can't we actually use it to assess if these medicines are making patients better? Or to Dave's point, who's responding better versus not? Again, to the point of precision medicine. And then the last thing, I think one of our biggest hurdles is going to be change. It's not just going to be the data science technical aspect of it, it's going to be the human element. A lot of people hear about AI and they think about it's going to replace or make somebody redundant, versus it's actually enhancing the many ways we can improve what we do today, the processes we have today. But then, getting clinicians to change, getting physicians to change, getting businesses to change and actually use it as part of their decision makings. I think that, I'll give you an example. When we talk about finding the right sites, we can find them, but the follow through to actually get people to open new sites in community clinics we have never been in before, where the patients actually exist, huge people change. It's changing hearts and minds. That's going to be one of our biggest hurdles.
We've got a question from the audience that I want to turn toward quickly in our last few minutes here, and then we'll jump in if we have some time with one or two others. I've got a question here about AI and bias, and I know I feel like everybody's heard a lot about a lot of the bias issues in AI related to identifying people and skin tone and things like that. In your specific fields, I mean, what are the bias problems that you all are trying to be aware of and conscious of, or focusing on? I feel like every time, anytime you go further in any kind of, research or advancement, you're going to discover problems that you didn't know you had. So what are the kind of bias issues that you all are thinking about and trying to keep in mind as these technologies are being developed?
One thing I would say on the bias problem is that, obviously, algorithms are subject to bias, and they're based on the data that went into them and the people who built them and trained them for particular problems. And so they're kind of reflective of that underlying substrate that they're off of. And so it's difficult to completely eliminate bias. But what the value is you can actually make that bias fair. You can show it, you can see it, and you can try to minimize that, which is a little bit different from the bias that's all around in our healthcare, right now, that we don't necessarily see. And there's documented, proof of, difference in treatments to patients on pain based on, racial diversity. A clinical trial example that was raised earlier is an excellent example where the diversity historically in clinical trials has been really low, and the drugs that are approved are not representative of our population. And so we're really proud of the work we've done as well in terms of leveraging AI algorithms to actually reverse these biases, right, and that are inherent in our system. So.
Yeah. I would say I totally agree. I mean, it's having a lot of rigor in the methodology and how you build AI algorithms is probably the most critical piece. There's a concept of data stewardship. What does that mean? Every single data set, at least on my team, when the team starts working on it, we look at the appropriate, distribution for socioeconomic, racial, even in terms of not just academic medical centers, you're getting it from community clinics. Now, if nothing is perfect, so being transparent about the limitations of the data up front, super important. Then there's a piece around once the algorithm is developed, making sure you actually validate it across many different health systems. Drew, that does not happen enough. That takes work, it takes time, but it's actually the right thing to do because you make it generalizable. And then the third thing I'll say, once you deploy that algorithm, the work is not done. You have to see how it's being used, not just the algorithm itself, but the decisions that it's actually creating. And are those biased versus not? And I do think you can use AI for good. Like the clinical trial example, we in the model factored in diversity. And that's why we ended up going to places, 70, 80% of the counties we went to had over-indexed on racial diversity. And we ended up with one of the most diverse trials for COVID-19. So all I'm trying to say is if you use the data the right way and you're really rigorous, you can and be transparent as to the limitation, that's what we need to do. But, the challenge is with so much hype and the need for speed, there's a lot of work being done and all of them are not created equal. And it only takes one bad example for the space to regress, for a new emerging space to regress. That's one of the things that keeps me up at night personally.
I think that last point there about monitoring the real life is just so important, right? You have to make sure that when this thing is real life in the world, is it making the decisions that you want it, right? Yeah. And it's the behaviors and outcomes what you expected.